Hi everyone, and welcome to The Neverending Story, The Cultural Evolution of Narratives, Part 9. In this lecture we'll be talking about the contemporary issue of fake news and how some of the cultural evolution theories and approaches that we've been talking about throughout the course of this module could be applied to understanding the appeal and the spread of fake news. This lecture is by me, Joe Stubbersfield. Fake news. So fake news could be considered to be a major contemporary issue. It's thought to have a negative effect on increased polarization of our societies, a negative effect on democracy, and also trust in institutions. It's argued that fake news played a key role in events such as Brexit and the 2016 US election. But what do we mean by fake news? So fake news encompasses a wide range of different types of information, and it's been put forward that it encompasses 7 types of mis- and disinformation. This includes satire or parody, which has no intention to cause harm, but has a potential to fool people and for people to misinterpret its content. It includes articles which make a false connection, so when headlines or visuals or captions don't actually support the content of the article. Misleading content, where there is misleading use of information to frame an issue or an individual in misleading content. False context, where genuine content is shared with false contextual information. Imposter content, when genuine sources are impersonated. Manipulated content, when genuine information or imagery is manipulated in order to deceive people. To wholesale fabricated content, which is new content that is 100% false and designed to deceive and do harm. So these examples can be found in a whole range of different sources, from Weekly World News, a kind of parody tabloid with stories about aliens and Bigfoot. This is an example of imposter news, so it's meant to look like ABC News but is in fact actually not ABC News as you might know it. To websites that are really dedicated to spreading false information. Fake news could be considered to be often contemporary versions of conspiracy theories and urban legends, and ultimately these are more stories and are subject to the same cultural evolutionary processes as other narratives, the same cultural evolutionary processes that we've been talking about in relation to other genres in this module. And fake news is apparently very successful in terms of exploiting the biases we've been talking about in order to gain cultural success. Vosoughi, Roy, and Aral conducted a study using tweets to test the diffusion of verified true and false news. They used 4.5 million tweets, which were from the website Twitter, which were put online between 2006 and 2017. This includes the data of 3 million users and covers 126,000 news stories. So this is an example of big data studies. They looked at the number of cascades, which were unbroken retweet chains with a common origin, and compared those between verified true news and verified false news. They found that true stories took 6 times as long to reach 1,500 people compared to the false news stories. And they also found that true news stories took 20 times as long to have a cascade depth of 10. This means the number of retweets in an unbroken train. This is the cascades. And you can see from this study that the peaks of false news tended to coincide with peaks of real news being spread. However, they tended to be larger peaks. But how am I cultural evolution approach the spread of fake news? We might consider that fake news exploits biases, some of the biases we've been talking about in this module, like social information bias, negativity bias, and our biases for in-group favoritism and out-group negativity, but also other biases as well, like MCI. Alberto Acerbi conducted a content analysis of fake news articles to test if these biases that we've been talking about were exploited by these fake news articles. His study covered 260 fake news articles that were collected online, and he coded them for the presence of bias-evoking content. 86% of these articles contained some kind of relevant content. So we'll start by looking at the content bias for social information. You'll remember that social information bias is a result of humans evolving greater intelligence in order to form and keep track of alliances and relationships in a large, complex social group. This means that we are prone to attending to, recalling, and transmitting social information over equivalent other information. Acerbi found that about half of the fake news articles could be described as involving social interactions and gossip, and also almost half of them covered some kind of celebrity content, which was also considered to be some kind of social information. These types of content were in fact the most common of all the bias exploiting content that was found in this study. Now we'll move on to a bias for content that evokes greater levels of emotion. In the Vosoughi and colleagues study, they found that the most common emotions that were evoked by fake news were fear, disgust, and surprise. Similarly, Acerbi found that less than 10% of the fake news articles were coded as evoking positive emotions, and that content evoking negative emotions were 5 times more numerous. Around 15% listed disgust, which is an emotion that is largely absent from real news. So these fake news articles were predominantly negative in terms of their emotional valence, and also elicited emotions like disgust, which is very rare to be evoked by real news. But why might this be the case? You'll remember from the previous lecture that we seem to have a bias for threat-related information. However, there may be something more than that going on in terms of fake news. So to think about that, we need to answer the question of which of these two stories is more believable. Despite their fierce appearance, German Shepherds are considered loyal and intelligent pets. A recent study in the US notes that other breeds of dog are responsible for 89% of dog attacks. So do you find that story to be more believable or less believable than this story? Although proponents consider German Shepherds loyal and intelligent pets, a recent study in the US notes that this breed of dog is responsible for 11% of dog attacks. So which of these two stories do you find more believable? Or what about these two stories? Many people find rare ground beef patties delicious. However, 13% of ground beef patties contain bacteria that could cause illness if eaten rare. Or this story. Many people find rare ground beef patties delicious. 87% of ground beef patties are free of bacteria that could cause illness if eaten rare. You may have noticed that the stories that you've been presented with actually contain the same kinds of information in terms of the statistics that they're presenting you with. However, they're framed differently. In one case, they're framed in a positive sense, and in one case, they're presented in a negative sense. This is based on a study by Fessler and colleagues, who are investigating negative credulity. They conducted a survey titled Truth or Trash? How Believable is the News Today? And presented participants with two versions of articles which were framed either positively or negatively. And the participants had to rate these articles from 1 to 7 in terms of how believable they found these stories to be. It was found that the negatively framed stories were rated as higher for believability, meaning that people were more likely to believe stories if they were framed in a negative way compared to a positive way. So it might be that bad news or news which is framed in a negative way is actually more believable than positive news. Also related to the appeal of bad news or negative emotions in these fake news stories is threat bias. Acherby found that around 30% of the fake news stories which were coded in his study were threat related. So this includes stories about serial killers, bombers, and sexual offenders. And again, like in conspiracy theories, this combination of negativity and threat with in-group and out-group biases is a powerful combination of biases in fake news. So in this example, fake news was spread about the elected mayor of a town in New Jersey. He can be seen in the picture in the article to the right. The man in the left is actually not him at all. Now, for one thing, he had no intention of abolishing Christmas, and also you might be able to tell that he also wasn't a Muslim. He was in fact Sikh. However, to many people in America, his race meant that he was an outgroup, and this combination of outgroup threat with threats to institutions like Christmas provide appealing stories to individuals who might hold those kinds of beliefs. But what about other biases? So in a previous module, we talked about sex and romance in fiction and how commonly those are found. In fake news, there's certainly sex, but it tends to be associated with disgust rather than romance. Sexual themes were found in 17% of the articles coded in the Acherby study. However, these were most commonly associated with disgusting content rather than any kind of romance. So the examples you see on the slide are taken from some of the most shared fake news articles on Facebook. And what about minimally counterintuitive biases? So it's certainly true that we see fake news articles including stories about Bigfoot or aliens, but these were actually coded as relatively low in number. Only 13% of the articles coded in the Acherby study contained some kind of counterintuitive content. It may be that the news format that is involved in fake news requires a higher level of credibility than stories which are simply passed around by word of mouth. So to conclude, fake news is a contemporary issue and is apparently having a serious effect on our society. Its appeal and the reason why it's spreading so widely can be explained by cultural evolution theory. And the key issue is that it exploits cognitive biases, many of which have been discussed in these modules. Biases for social information, for negativity and threat information, and also for in-group positivity and out-group negativity.